Okay, we've been looking at the worldwide flood and all its indications. It seems to go on forever. All the indications that a worldwide flood did occur and evidently wiped out anything that might have to do with evolution, if there ever was, because it was a worldwide flood. And it provided its own geological strata with dead creatures, fossils, instantaneously, always in different orders. Never according to the textbook. Now we look and say, well, okay, so what? What is the evidence of a worldwide flood other than that? And we're looking at the amount of water on the surface of the earth testifies to a worldwide flood. It's K39. Here's the address, K39. And we're going to look at this and see where in the world are there indications of the fact that there was a worldwide flood, not just local floods. Put together, is it a lot of local floods or maybe one worldwide flood? There's always been a lot of local floods all the time around the world, every day perhaps. Anyway, there is much evidence that sea level was once much lower relative to the land surfaces than is at present, implying either that the amount of water in the ocean was much smaller in the past, or that some parts of the sea bottom have dropped, or both. In the past decade have been discovered great numbers of seamounts, which are nothing but drowned islands out in the middle of the ocean. These are flat-topped and therefore non-volcanic in formation, and are now in many cases more than 1,000 fathoms below the surface. Yet they give abundant evidence of having once been above the surface. Dr. Edwin Hamilton, marine geologist. They are fossil landforms preserved in the depths of the sea, where they are disturbed only by light currents and the slow rain of pelagic material from the waters above. He goes on to say, submarine canyons constitute another very intriguing indication that the ocean level was once much lower relative to the present seacoast than at present. There are great canyons, similar in every respect to the great river canyons of the land surface, but extending under the ocean far out on the continental shelves. Usually they project seaward from a river valley on the land. One of the best known is the Submarine Canyon, extending out some 300 miles to the deep sea floor from the mouth of the Hudson River, New York. These canyons exist in great numbers around every continent of the world. Francis P. Shepard. Their striking similarity to canyons on land certainly would seem to favor the view that they were formed above the ocean. However, this would require a differential lowering of the ocean by at least several thousand feet, and therefore other explanations have been assiduously sought. There have been some geologists who strongly maintain the subaerial surface of the earth origin of the canyons, accounting for the sea level lowering by means of the storage of water in the glacial ice sheets of the so-called Pleistocene age. I say so-called because so far we haven't actually got real evidence that there were these such ages. In a recent review of the problem, W.D. Thornberry, professor of geology, says, the difficulties encountered in explaining the lowering of sea level necessary for the canyons to have been cut by streams seem insurmountable. If Tolstoy's conclusion that Hudson Canyon extends down to a depth of 15,000 feet is correct, the magnitude of lowering of sea level to permit subaerial canyon cutting seems beyond any possibility of realization. Disney World. William D. Thornberry. So the physical evidence and scripture both reveal that a universal worldwide flood actually occurred in the recent past. But he says it is thus primarily the difficulty of accounting for the much lower former sea level that has caused most geologists to attempt to find ways of explaining the origin of the canyons while under the sea. The most generally accepted hypothesis of the evolutionists at present being that they were formed by turbidity currents, or flows of mixtures of water and sediment underwater. This theory also has many difficulties, so that Thornberry says, after reviewing all the theories, he says, the origin of submarine canyons remains a perplexing problem. The theory that they were cut by turbidity currents, aided by submarine landsliding, slumping, and creep, holds a slightly favored position, not so much because it answers all the questions connected with them, but because it encounters fewer difficulties than any other theory, except the universal flood theory, which they haven't even considered. It's, blind eye to the evidence. It would seem, on the other hand, that deluge conditions, as inferred from the scriptural record, could give a reasonable explanation for their origin. As the lands were uplifted and the ocean basins depressed at the close of the deluge period, the great currents streaming down into the ocean depths would quickly have eroded great gorges in the still soft and unconsolidated sediments exposed by the sinking of the basins. Then, as the gorges were themselves submerged by the continuing influx of waters from the rising continental blocks, it may well have been that the turbidity currents entering the canyons may have deepened and extended them still farther, a process which has continued on a smaller scale throughout the centuries since. These and other evidences prompted Dr. K.K. Landis, head of the Geology Department of Michigan University, to say, "Can we, as seekers after truth, shut our eyes any longer to the obvious fact that large areas of seafloor have sunk vertical distance measured in miles? And furthermore, can they ignore the fact that there is plainly much more water in the oceans than before?" Kenneth Landis, Illogical Geology. Welcome to Evolution. Enclosed lake basins and raised beaches testify to much more water in the past. There is strong evidence, for example, that much more water once filled the lakes and flowed in the rivers of the earth than is true at present. This is the picture revealed by the raised beaches and terraces found all over the world, as well as the evidence that desert regions were once well watered. Marine fossils right there in the desert. With respect to enclosed lake basins, the American limnologist G.E. Hutchinson of Yale says, almost all the drainage basins of the closed lakes of the world bear, above the modern lake level, raised beaches which clearly testify to high lake levels at a previous time. Bonneville and Lehotten are only two of the more dramatic examples. G. Elvin Hutchinson, Treatise on Limnology. Limnology is scientific study of freshwater bodies. They also have their special little terms. How about freshwater bodies? Lake Bonneville, mentioned by Hutchinson, it was a great lake that once covered much of Utah, the present Great Salt Lake being one of its small remnants. It still shows at least 4 distinct strand lines, the oldest and highest and oldest being about 1,000 feet above the present level of Great Salt Lake and covering an area almost 20,000 square miles. W.D. Thornberry, Principles of Geomorphology. Lake Lehotten, mostly in Nevada. Lehotten has 3 major strand lines and covers some 8,400 square miles. These are huge evidences. How did this get formed? With only a few insignificant relict lakes which are remnant from greater sized lakes in the past, left of it at present, this entire region, now the most arid part of the United States, once was covered with an abundance of lakes and other features of a relatively humid climate. Lake Tahoe in California was 655 feet above its present remnant and probably connected with Lake Manly, which occupied the present site of Death Valley. The same phenomena is found in other parts of the world, Thornberry says. There are many examples outside the United States of similar lake expansions during pluvial glacial times. Lake Texcoco in Mexico was at least 175 feet higher than it is now. Lake Titicaca in South America was 300 feet higher. Dead Sea was 1,400 feet higher, and as much as 15 abandoned strand lines have been observed around it. Caspian Sea was at least 250 feet higher and was apparently confluent with the Aral Sea to the east and the Black Sea to the west. Lakes in Kenya Colony and Abyssinia in Africa, were greatly expanded, as was Lake Erie in Australia. Thornberry says, even in the world's greatest deserts, such as the Sahara, an abundance of testimony exists that the climate in fairly recent times was more humid. It is quite reasonable, on the other hand, to explain many or most of these raised beaches around enclosed basins in terms of the gradually retreating floodwaters. Simplest. At the termination of the deluge year, the uplift of the lands resulted in a continental topography of much higher relief than before the flood, and this rugged topography included many of these interior basins in which large amounts of water were trapped. In most cases, however, these high levels could not be maintained by the local precipitation, so that over the years the lakes gradually dried up. This process was intermittent, owing to changing meteorological conditions, and perhaps also to occasional regional uplifts still occurring. Each period of meteorological and tectonic stability resulted in the formation of another strand line. Evidence of pluviation, geologic changes resulting from rainfall, and high lake levels, and even stronger in the regions supposedly covered by continental glaciers, but presumably these are all to be attributed to glacial meltwaters, glacier-dammed streams, and similar factors related to the ice sheets. Whatever the explanation, whatever in terms of glacial effects or retreating flood waters, or both, it is abundantly plain that waters from some source occupied the extensive areas which are now dry land and produce many and varied aqueous, erosional, and depositional features. Most of the thousands of lakes now found in the northern states of this country are believed to be remnants of glacial lakes formed by the great ice sheet. Similar phenomena are found in other countries. The glacial Great Lakes, for example, covered an immensely greater region than even their present large remnants. The great complexity of the old lake deposits and erosional features has made their history difficult to decipher, especially for evolutionists. Their history has been worked out by tracing topographic features that mark positions of former lake levels and outlets. Such features include wave-cut cliffs and associated features such as arches and caves, beaches and associated bars, lacustrine deposits, dunes back of former shorebelines, and spillways or outlets cut across bedrock or glacial deposits, which are today occupied by underfit streams too small for the valleys they flow through to have been formed by them, and exhibit accumulations of peat or muck in abandoned channels. Even in the greatest canyon, Grand Canyon, Colorado River, doesn't have the capacity to have formed that canyon. A whole bunch of water first. Goes straight down to bedrock and then out, and leaving the Colorado River to there still today. Thornby, it is evident that these features could also be explained in terms of large water bodies remnant from the flood, pluvial climates persisting after the flood for a time and continuing intermittent uplift of the lands. It may be that the difficulty of unraveling Great Lakes history has been in part due to the neglect of this very factor of the flood. We recognize, however, that much evidence exists in favor of the glacial explanation of the lakes, and we see no necessary reason to question it from the biblical point of view. In either case, whether the water came directly from the retreating deluge waters, or indirectly, only directly from them by the way of the great ice sheet to which they contributed, it is clear that in the very recent geologic past, both in glaciated and non-glaciated regions, a much greater part of our present continents was covered by water than at present. Worldwide flood. All right, we're going to go back next time and look at the evidence of much greater river activity in the past.